Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to sit with you a while in the quiet of this hour. Tell me, is there paper nearby? Perhaps a book left open, the soft remains of an evening's tea? These are the details Watson noticed first, the small, honest arrangements of a life observed from the inside. Tonight we follow his pen into a world of locked cabinets, altered documents, and the kind of truth that hides not in shadows, but in plain sight. Do subscribe, so no chapter escapes you. Now, settle in. For as a reason itself insists, one must never trust to general impressions, but concentrate upon the detail. Chapter 1. The Order of Queen Anne Street. There are certain afternoons in the life of Baker Street that linger in the memory with a peculiar and undeserved vividness. Not because anything remarkable occurred during their early hours, but because they served as the quiet prologue to events of considerable consequence. The afternoon of the 14th of October, in that year which I shall not more precisely identify, was precisely such a one. I had called upon my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes in the early afternoon, having concluded my morning rounds with rather more expedition than I had anticipated, and found him in one of those states of abstracted repose that the uninitiated might mistake for idleness. He lay upon the sofa with his long legs extended and his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, the attitude he invariably adopted when engaged in what he termed the hard labour of mental reconstruction. A thin curl of blue smoke rose from the pipe abandoned in the ashtray beside him, and the room was rich with its aroma. The morning papers lay unread upon the floor, and a letter, its envelope slit with clinical precision, rested upon the mantelpiece between the tobacco slipper and the jackknife that skewered his correspondence. "You look well, Watson," said he, without opening his eyes, as I settled into my customary chair. "The morning air of Kensington suits a man who has been cooped too long indoors." "I had not supposed you aware of my arrival," I confessed, somewhat startled. "The creak of the third stair, the particular hesitation before you knock, and the faint scent of that carbolic preparation you favour after a surgical consultation. These, my dear fellow, are signatures as legible to me as your name upon a prescription." He opened one grey eye and regarded me with a thin smile. "I have been expecting a visitor of a rather different sort, however, and your arrival is a welcome interlude. Sit down. There is nothing of interest in the papers today save a letter to the editor complaining of forgeries in the rare manuscript trade, and I fancy that will soon be of more than academic concern." He had scarcely finished the sentence when we heard the voice of Mrs. Hudson below, engaged in one of her characteristic exchanges with a caller, measured, polite, yet tinged with that air of proprietary wariness that she reserved for visitors who arrived unannounced. Presently she appeared at the door, bearing upon her face the expression of a woman delivering news of uncertain quality. "A Mr. Alistair Penbury to see you, Mr. Holmes," said she. "He was most particular that you should know he comes from Queen Anne Street." Holmes was upon his feet before she had finished speaking. The languor of the previous hour entirely vanished, replaced by that electric alertness which I had come to recognise as the truest indicator of his professional interest. "Send him up at once, Mrs. Hudson, and pray bring us tea. Mr. Penbury, Watson," he added, turning to me with quickened eyes, "is one of those figures who inhabit the margins of respectability with considerable grace. An antiquarian and document broker, or, to give him his proper professional designation, an authenticator of rare manuscripts for aristocratic families and government offices alike. His establishment in Queen Anne Street is known to every senior curator in London, and his reputation is considered, in most quarters, impeccable. The word most is doing considerable work in that sentence." Before I could inquire further into this suggestive qualification, the door opened and Mr. Alistair Penbury entered our sitting room. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the spare, upright bearing of one accustomed to the preservation of things. Manuscripts, perhaps, or dignity, or both. His silver hair was brushed with deliberate neatness, his suit of dark grey wool cut by a Jermyn Street hand, and his boots exhibited the high polish of a gentleman who believed that the outer surface of a man reflects the inner order of his mind. His features were fine and slightly drawn, the features of a man who spent his days in the company of old paper and close argument, and his eyes were alert without being warm. He carried a hat and gloves which he placed upon the table with the precision of a man who catalogues everything he touches. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I am grateful for your time. I shall not pretend I have not hesitated before making this visit. A man in my profession is acutely sensitive to the merest suggestion of impropriety." "Sit down, Mr. Penbury," said Holmes pleasantly, gesturing to the chair across from mine. "Dr. Watson is my trusted colleague and has my complete confidence. Pray tell us, without unnecessary preamble, what has disturbed the order of Queen Anne Street?" Penbury arranged himself in the chair with the careful economy of a man whose every movement is considered. He drew a slow breath before speaking, and I noticed that his hands, though steady upon the surface, bore the faintest tremor at the fingertips, not of age, I thought, but of suppressed anxiety. "I maintain," he said, "a locked cabinet in the study of my home. It is a piece of some age, walnut, with an iron-banded interior fitted in recent years with a modern steel lock of the Brahma pattern. It contains private commissions, wills awaiting my verification, military records under review, land deeds held in trust. The nature of my work requires absolute discretion, and the cabinet is accordingly treated with the gravity of a bank vault. The key never leaves my person. It hangs upon my watch chain, as you may observe." He produced from his waistcoat pocket a gold watch chain from which depended among its fobs a small but evidently robust key of unusual manufacture. Holmes leaned forward, examined it without touching it, and nodded for Penbury to continue. "Someone," said Penbury in a tone that he plainly strove to keep measured, "has tampered with that cabinet, or more precisely has attempted to do so. Nothing is missing. I have checked each document against my inventory with the most scrupulous attention. Yet I am as certain as I stand, as I sit before you, Mr. Holmes, that something has been disturbed. There is evidence of interference which I cannot satisfactorily explain." "Describe this evidence," said Holmes, his fingers returning to their familiar steeple beneath his chin. "The cabinet doors, when I opened them this morning, were not precisely as I left them. The upper left hinge, which bears a characteristic resistance requiring a certain angle of pull to release cleanly, as had been operated without that resistance, suggesting the person who last opened it was unfamiliar with its particular temperament, and there was a scent." Penbury paused, and I saw that slight tightening about the eyes that precedes an admission of something troubling. "A scent of sealing wax. Not my sealing wax, which is a dark Venetian red of a kind I import from a stationer in Holborn. This was different, a lighter, more acrid composition. Foreign, I think." "Who comprises your household, Mr. Penbury?" I asked, for Holmes had fallen into one of his rapid internal calculations, and appeared temporarily disinclined to speak. Penbury turned to me with a kind of relieved courtesy, as though a simpler question was welcome relief from the territory into which Holmes's silence had been leading him. "My wife, Elizabeth. My daughter Clara, who is engaged to a rising young barrister named Forsyth. My junior clerk, Edmund Lyle, who lodges with us during the working week as a matter of convenience. He assists with the preliminary cataloguing of documents and is entirely trusted, and Colonel James Harcourt, a retired officer who's been a family friend and occasional investor in certain of my commissions for the better part of 12 years. He dines with us on Thursdays as a rule, and was with us this past week." "A well-ordered house," said Holmes, who had emerged from his reverie with characteristic abruptness. "And yet someone within it, or with access to it, has taken an interest in your papers. You are quite certain nothing has been removed?" "Quite certain. And nothing added." There was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. I watched Penbury's face with some care during those 3 seconds, for I have learned, in long association with Holmes, that the value of an answer is often most clearly visible in the moment before it is given. Something moved behind the antiquarian's composed features, not guilt precisely, but a rapid, private calculation, before he said quite smoothly, "Nothing that I have detected, no." Holmes said nothing immediately. He rose, moved to the window, and stood with his back to us for a moment, looking down upon the busy October street below. When he turned, his expression was that of a man who has decided to accept a commission while fully aware that its stated terms are incomplete. "Very well, Mr. Penbury. Watson and I shall call upon you tomorrow morning, if that is convenient, and examine the cabinet and the study. I should be grateful if you would ensure that all members of your household are present and available to speak with us. In the meantime, I advise you to leave the cabinet precisely as it stands, to touch nothing in the study that is not essential to the ordinary conduct of your day, and to confide in no one outside this room the reason for our visit." Penbury rose, retrieved his hat and gloves, and shook hands with both of us with the manner of a man considerably lighter in spirit than he had entered. When he'd gone, his footsteps receding with deliberate steadiness upon the stair, Holmes returned to the sofa and resumed his former posture, but his eyes were open now, and fixed upon the ceiling with a brightness that told me his mind was already engaged upon the problem. "Well, Holmes," said I, "he seemed a man of considerable self-possession." "Indeed he did," said Holmes. "Calmness, Watson, can be the most deliberate mask of all. Pour me a cup of that tea, there's a good fellow, and let us consider what a respected antiquarian, who insists nothing has been removed or added, might conceivably stand to lose by telling us the precise and unvarnished truth." He reached for his pipe, and the October dusk gathered softly at the windows of Baker Street. Chapter 2. The Cabinet in the Study. The following morning broke grey and still over London, the kind of autumn morning that holds its breath, neither raining nor relenting, the sky the colour of old pewter, and the streets below Baker Street slick with a dew that had not quite decided to become fog. I arrived at 9:15 to find Holmes already dressed and in full possession of his faculties, which is to say he was standing at the window with his coat on and his hat in his hand, exhibiting all the patience of a man who has been waiting for some time and intends you to know it without saying so directly. "You are 4 minutes later than I expected," said he by way of greeting. "Good morning to you as well," I replied, reaching for my own coat and stick. "I had a patient." "You had a patient whose condition was not serious, whose visit you could have deferred, and whom you attended out of professional conscientiousness rather than medical necessity. The slight chalk on your right cuff suggests you paused to write a prescription rather than to examine. No matter, 4 minutes is easily recovered. The cab is waiting." I didn't ask how he had arranged a cab before I arrived, for experience had long since taught me that certain of Holmes's minor conjuring tricks were best accepted rather than interrogated. We descended to the street, and within the half-hour we were set down before a handsome terraced house in Queen Anne Street, its white stucco front as composed and correct as its owner had presented himself the previous afternoon. A manservant admitted us, and conducted us without delay to the study, where Penbury was already present, standing beside his desk with the expression of a man who has not slept well. The room itself rewarded immediate attention. It was high-ceilinged and well-proportioned, lined on 2 walls with shelves of leather-bound volumes and card-indexed document boxes, each labelled in a precise clerical hand. The desk was a substantial mahogany piece positioned to receive the light from the single-tall window, and upon it lay the materials of Penbury's trade: a magnifying glass, a set of nibs, 2 inkwells, one black, one the dark red he had mentioned, a stick of his Venetian sealing wax, and a brass stamp bearing his professional cipher. Against the far wall stood the cabinet. It was a handsome thing in its way, built of dark walnut with age-blackened iron banding along its corners and edges, the proportion suggesting the work of a craftsman of the previous century. Its doors were fitted with a lock that was emphatically modern, a Bramah cylinder, bright steel among the old wood, like a new tooth in an ancient jaw. Holmes crossed to it immediately, crouching to examine the lock with his glass, then straightening to study the hinges, the frame, the floor immediately before it, and finally the interior, which Penbury unlocked for him with the key from his watch chain. I watched Holmes work with the attention of a man who has learned to read that particular performance. His examination was thorough and unhurried, and he spoke not at all during it, which told me more than speech would have done. When Holmes is silent during a physical examination, the silence is not absence of thought, but excess of it. He's moving too quickly through conclusions to bother narrating them. "The remaining members of the household," Holmes said at last, still studying the interior of the cabinet. "Are they available?" "They are in the drawing-room," said Penbury. "I asked them to remain at home this morning as you requested. My wife finds the situation distressing. Clara is composed, after the manner of young women who have decided composure is expected of them. Lyle arrived early. He keeps punctual hours. Harcourt was good enough to come over from his club. Excellent. I shall speak with them presently. For now, Mr. Penbury, I should like you to stand precisely where you stood when you first noticed the disturbance, and tell me again, in exact sequence, what you observed." Penbury moved to the cabinet and repeated his account. The resistance of the hinge, the unfamiliar scent. Holmes listened without interruption, his eyes moving between Penbury's hands and face with that steady, dispassionate attention that some men found encouraging and others found deeply unsettling. When Penbury finished, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, come and smell the interior of the right-hand door. There, just at the joint of the upper hinge." I bent and inhaled carefully. It was faint but unmistakable, an acrid, slightly sweet note beneath the cedar and old paper smell of the cabinet's interior. It was not unpleasant exactly, but it was foreign to the room. It did not belong among Penbury's careful preservations. "Sealing wax," I said, "though not the kind on the desk." "Precisely so. A composition I associate with certain continental suppliers. German, at a preliminary guess, though I shall verify that against my reference notes. It is not sold by any London stationer I am aware of, and certainly not by the Holborn establishment Mr. Penbury favours." Holmes straightened and addressed our client. "Now, the documents within the cabinet. You maintain an inventory, you said." "A written inventory, yes, kept separately, in the desk drawer." "Bring it out, if you please." Penbury produced a leather-bound ledger of moderate thickness, and Holmes spent some 10 minutes comparing its entries against the contents of the cabinet with methodical patience, lifting each document by its edges and examining it briefly before replacing it. I occupied myself in a quiet survey of the room, for I have found over the years that a room speaks its own language if one attends to it properly, and Holmes's example, however inimitable in its precision, has given me an eye for the irregular. What I noticed was this. The desk, for all its professional tidiness, bore a faint inconsistency. The black inkwell was positioned an inch or so further from the blotter than the red. The pen rest held 2 nibs rather than the single one a working morning would normally require, and the blotter itself, though clean on its face, was slightly bowed at one corner, the corner nearest the cabinet, as though it had been lifted recently and replaced with almost but not quite complete accuracy. I said nothing of this for the moment, knowing well enough that Holmes would reach it in his own time and by his own route. "Everything is present," Holmes announced, closing the cabinet and handing the ledger back to Penbury. "Your inventory is accurate and your documents are intact. Nothing has been removed." He paused, replacing his glass in his breast pocket. "Tell me, in the ordinary course of your work, do you seal documents here in the study or elsewhere?" "Here, always. The study is the only room in which I conduct professional business." "And do you ever work at the cabinet itself, standing before it with documents in hand, or do you bring papers to the desk?" "To the desk, invariably. The cabinet is for storage only." Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already assumed. "One further question, and then I shall trouble you no more for the present. The foreign wax, could it have been introduced by any document already in the cabinet? Something received from abroad, perhaps, already sealed?" Penbury considered this with evident sincerity. "It is possible, in theory, but I examine every incoming document upon receipt, and I should have noticed an unfamiliar wax at that stage." "Unless," said Holmes pleasantly, You were not the first to examine it." He left the implication suspended in the quiet room, like the dust motes that turned slowly in the thin October light, and turned toward the door. "Now," said he, "I believe there is a drawing room and 4 people in it who are waiting to assist us. Come, Watson." I followed him into the corridor, and as I passed the desk I paused for just a moment, looking again at the displaced inkwell, the extra nib, the bowed corner of the blotter. Small things, all of them. And yet I had learned well enough in the years of my association with Sherlock Holmes that it is precisely the small things that carry the weight of the large ones, quietly and without announcement, until the moment when they may be ignored no longer. Chapter 3. The Incident Revealed. It is one of the more humbling aspects of my long association with Sherlock Holmes that the moments I am most inclined to believe a matter is settling toward resolution are invariably the moments at which it chooses to deepen. We had left Queen Anne Street that Tuesday morning with the comfortable impression of having established certain preliminary facts, and with the prospect of quiet interviews ahead. By Thursday, the character of the affair had changed entirely. The message arrived at Baker Street shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning, delivered by a boy in Penbury's household livery, and written in a hand that was not Penbury's own. It was brief to the point of abruptness. Mr. Penbury had been found unconscious in his study the previous evening. He had been conveyed upstairs and the family physician summoned. Would Mr. Holmes come at once? Holmes read it standing, handed it to me without comment, and reached for his coat. We found the house in Queen Anne Street altered in atmosphere as thoroughly as if the building itself had taken ill. The manservant who admitted us wore the particular expression of domestic staff caught between professional composure and genuine alarm, and the hallway, ordinarily so precise in its order, held the residue of recent hurry, a chair displaced, a lamp still burning unnecessarily in the morning light, a pair of overshoes abandoned beside the umbrella stand. Mrs. Penbury received us in the morning room. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with a face that might under easier circumstances have been described as handsome, and which now presented the careful blankness of one who has spent the night holding herself very firmly together. Her dress was immaculate. Her hands, folded in her lap, were not. "He was found at 9:30, she said, in the measured tone of a woman reciting facts because facts are more manageable than feelings. Clara went to call him for supper and found the study door ajar. He was on the floor beside the cabinet. The cabinet was open. Papers were on the desk. "Was he conscious when found?" I asked, for this was properly my province. "He stirred when Clara called out, but could not speak coherently. Dr. Anstruther came within the half hour and attributed it to shock, or possibly a spasm of the heart. He's resting now, and is not to be disturbed." "I should like to look in upon him briefly," I said, "with your permission, and with the assurance that I shall not tax him." She gave a short nod, and Holmes touched my arm lightly. "I shall go directly to the study," said he to Mrs. Penbury. "You have left it undisturbed." "As you had instructed." "Yes." Holmes regarded her for a moment with that calm, measuring attention that he bestowed impartially upon evidence of all kinds. "Thank you, Mrs. Penbury. Your composure under these circumstances is remarkable." "It is necessary," said she simply, and there was something in the 2 words that struck me as rather more eloquent than she perhaps intended. I found Penbury in his bedroom, propped upon pillows with the grey, deflated look of a man from whom some essential pressure has been abruptly released. His breathing was regular, which relieved me, and his pulse, when I took it, was weak but steady. His eyes opened at my entrance and recognised me with evident effort. "Mr. Holmes," he began. "Is below," I said quietly. "Do not exert yourself, Mr. Penbury. I'm going to ask you one question only, and I want you to answer it as briefly as you're able. What is the last thing you remember clearly?" He closed his eyes. "The study," he said after a moment. "I went in after dinner. I wanted to check. There was a document I'd been thinking about. A deed." A pause. "The cabinet was already open." "Already open?" "The door was ajar. I hadn't left it so." His eyes came open again, and in them I saw something that was not quite fear and not quite guilt, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between the two. Someone had been in there, Doctor. Someone had been at the papers. I assured him of our continued attention, advised him to rest, and took my leave. Downstairs I found Holmes in the study. The room had not been restored since the previous evening, and its disorder, though modest by any dramatic standard, was legible enough. Several documents lay spread across the desk, their arrangement suggesting neither the carelessness of haste nor the deliberateness of a thorough search, but something between the two, as though they had been placed there to be seen. The cabinet stood open, its key in the lock, and there, unmistakably, on the leather surface of the blotter, was a patch of ink still carrying the faint optical quality of the not quite dry. Holmes was crouched before the desk with his glass, examining the ink without touching it. "Fresh," I said, "or fresh as of last night at any rate." Within 2 hours of Penbury's collapse, I should estimate, given the degree of surface oxidation, Holmes straightened. "Note the position, Watson. The ink is centred on the blotter, not at the edge, where a man signing casually might press his nib, but in the middle, where one works at length on a document requiring repeated strokes. Someone sat here last night and wrote with some concentration. Could it not have been Penbury himself? It could, but Penbury tells you the cabinet was already open when he entered. If he did not open it, he did not remove these documents, and if he did not remove them, he did not arrange them on the desk. Someone else sat at this desk, worked at a document, and was either interrupted by Penbury's arrival or had already departed before it." I looked at the scattered papers. They were of varying kinds. A folded land deed whose red seal was intact, 2 sheets of close-written legal correspondence, and what appeared to be a military record of some age. Holmes had already examined them, I could tell from the slight repositioning of the upper corners. "What is missing?" I asked. Holmes moved to the cabinet and drew from his coat the small notebook in which he had recorded Penbury's inventory during our earlier visit. He worked through the comparison methodically, item by item, and when he closed the notebook his expression was of the particular quality I associated with significant discovery. Not surprise, for Holmes was rarely surprised, but a kind of precise satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who has been told something he already suspected. "One document," he said, "a deed of inheritance settlement, pertaining to certain properties in the county of Somerset. The named beneficiary, according to the inventory description, is Colonel James Harcourt." The name settled into the quiet room with some weight. "Harcourt," I said. "The Colonel himself stands to benefit considerably from that deed, if its contents are what the inventory description suggests. Its disappearance is therefore suggestive in one direction." Holmes closed the cabinet gently. "And yet," he said nothing further for a moment, moving instead to the window and looking out at the narrow strip of garden below, where the last of the autumn leaves lay in a patient copper drift along the wall. "The scene troubles me, Watson," he said at last, in a quieter register than his usual declarative tone, "not because it is confusing, but because it is rather too clear. The open cabinet, the scattered papers, the missing deed belonging to a man with an obvious financial interest. These are the components of a picture, and they have been assembled with some care. In my experience, evidence that presents itself this readily is evidence that has been introduced rather than merely discovered. You believe the scene was arranged?" "I believe," said Holmes, turning from the window, "that someone wished us to look at Colonel Harcourt. The question of whether that person and the person who actually took the deed are one and the same is precisely the question upon which this entire matter turns." He picked up his hat from the chair where he had set it. "Come, I want to speak with Edmund Lyle." I followed him into the corridor, and as I pulled the study door close behind me, I found myself thinking of Penbury's eyes. As he had said, someone had been at the papers, the unease in them, which had read to me less like a man describing the violation of his property than like a man confronting the consequences of his own. Chapter 4. Motives in Ink and Silence. Edmund Lyle was waiting in the small anteroom adjoining the study, a room that served Penbury's household as a kind of professional threshold, the place where clients were received before being admitted to the inner sanctum of the desk and cabinet. It contained 2 straight-backed chairs, a narrow writing table, a shelf of reference volumes, and Lyle himself, seated with his hands upon his knees and his back very straight, or in the manner of a young man who has decided that stillness is the most neutral posture available to him. He was younger than I had expected, not above 25, I judged, with a pale, precise face framed by dark hair that had been combed with some attention. His clothes were of good quality but not extravagant, the clothes of a man who understands that his position requires a certain presentation, without affording him the means to exceed it. His eyes were dark and quick, and they moved from Holmes to me and back again with an intelligence that was doing its best to appear merely attentive. "Mr. Lyle," said Holmes, taking the chair opposite without preamble. "You have worked for Mr. Penbury for how long?" 3 years and 4 months, said Lyle, with a precision that Holmes received with a slight inclination of the head. "And in that time you have acquired a thorough knowledge of his professional methods, the cataloguing, the authentication, the storage protocols. It is my function to assist with all of those, yes. Then you will be well placed to answer a technical question. When a document arrives at this house for authentication, what is the standard procedure for its initial handling?" Lyle shifted very slightly in his chair, so slightly that I would not have marked it had I not been attending with the particular watchfulness Holmes's presence always seemed to communicate to me. "Mr. Penbury examines each incoming document personally upon receipt," he said. "He makes a preliminary note in the intake ledger, assigns it a reference number, and places it in a temporary folder on his desk before transferring it to the cabinet once the initial inspection is complete." "And the temporary folder on the desk, is it secured during that interval?" "It is not locked, no. The desk itself has a drawer that latches, but the temporary folder is simply left on the surface. Accessible, in other words, to anyone who entered the study during the period between receipt and transfer. In theory." A careful pause. "But Mr. Penbury's study is not generally entered without his knowledge." "Generally," Holmes repeated pleasantly, as though the word were a small gift he intended to unwrap later. He leaned back. "Where were you yesterday evening, Mr. Lyle, between the hours of 8 and 10? "In my room. I retire early when there is cataloguing work to complete the following morning." "I heard nothing unusual until Clara, Miss Penbury, called out from the study." "You heard her call out?" "My room is directly above the study. The floors in this house are not especially substantial." "Quite so. And when you heard her, what did you do?" "I came downstairs immediately. Mr. Penbury was on the floor. I helped Miss Penbury support him to a chair and sent the manservant for Dr. Anstruther." Holmes studied him for a moment in silence. Lyle met the gaze with admirable steadiness, though I noticed that the hands upon his knees, which had been quite still, had now interlaced their fingers. "Thank you, Mr. Lyle. That will do for the present." When the clerk had gone, Holmes sat for a moment without speaking, his eyes on the middle distance. I had learned not to interrupt these brief intervals of consolidation. They were, or I had come to understand, the moments between receiving evidence and beginning to arrange it, and they were not to be disturbed. "Well," I said, when the silence had extended to what seemed a reasonable duration. "He answers very precisely," said Holmes. "Dates, hours, sequences, all delivered with the fluency of a man who has rehearsed accurate information, which is itself informative, Watson. The innocent, in my observation, rarely give times with quite such confidence. Memory in ordinary people is approximate. Mr. Lyle's memory is a ledger." We spent the remainder of the morning working through the papers that Holmes had been permitted to borrow from the study, the documents remaining in the cabinet, which Penbury's physician had reluctantly authorised Holmes to examine on condition that they be returned by evening. Holmes spread them across the sitting-room table in Baker Street, and went through them with his glass and a patience that was, as ever, total and impervious to the passage of time. I occupied myself with the case notes I was keeping, and with observation of Holmes, which is itself a species of useful work. It was past 2 o'clock when he set down his glass with a quiet deliberateness that I recognised. "Come and look at this," he said. I crossed to the table. He had separated 3 documents from the rest and laid them side by side. Each was, to my eye, a perfectly ordinary legal instrument. One a will, one a land transfer, one a deed of some kind with a wax seal at its foot. "The handwriting," said Holmes. "Look at the signature on the will, then look at the same name as it appears in the body of the land transfer." I looked. The signature was a flowing hand, assured and personal in the way of a man accustomed to signing his name to things of consequence. The same name in the body of the transfer was rendered in a slightly different character. The loops of the capitals marginally tighter, the downstroke of one letter at a fraction more incline. "They are not the same hand," I said slowly. "They are an extremely accomplished approximation of the same hand," Holmes corrected. "The differences are minute, detectable only because I am comparing them directly, and because I have made a study of such things. A solicitor glancing at the transfer in ordinary business would see nothing to trouble him. But these documents were not prepared by the same person, Watson. Someone has been interpolating alterations, or in the case of the land transfer, I suspect, substituting an amended version for the original, with very considerable skill." He moved to the 3rd document, the deed with the seal. "This one is more subtle still. The body of the text is genuine, but 2 lines have been added here." He pointed with a lean finger. "And here. The ink is fractionally different in its depth of colour. The quill pressure was slightly heavier. These additions change the conditions of the inheritance settlement quite materially." "In whose favour?" Holmes straightened and looked at me with an expression that was not without a certain sombre quality. "That is what makes this case interesting rather than merely intricate. The alterations in the will favour Colonel Harcourt. The amendments to the deed disadvantage him. The land transfer, if my reading is correct, would, if acted upon, deprive Miss Clara Penbury of a considerable portion of her anticipated dowry." He began to gather the papers carefully. "Someone has been busy, Watson, busy and subtle, and working across multiple documents over what I suspect is a considerable period of time. The question of who had the access, the skill and the motive to do so is one to which I believe we shall have a more complete answer before the week is out." "And Penbury himself?" I asked. Could he be the author of these alterations rather than their victim?" Holmes looked at me steadily. "It is a question that any honest investigation must hold open. A man who has spent 30 years in the authentication of documents would have both the knowledge and the fine motor command to produce work of this quality. And a man who has navigated the fine line between restoration and falsification, as whisper has it Penbury has done, is a man who knows the line intimately, which is to say, a man well positioned to cross it." He tied the documents carefully and set them beside his hat. Outside, the afternoon had thickened to a yellowish grey, and somewhere on Baker Street a vendor's call rose and faded in the damp air. "Every motive in this house," said Holmes half to himself, "rests not upon simple greed, but upon something older and less tractable. Reputation, inheritance, the fear of being seen as one truly is." He was quiet for a moment. "Those are the motives that produce the most careful crimes, and the most difficult to unpick cleanly." He said nothing further, and I returned to my notes, and writing in the gathering afternoon light while Holmes sat motionless in his chair, his fingers at their familiar steeple, turning the problem in that extraordinary mind of his as a jeweller turns a stone, slowly and from every angle, looking for the flaw that will tell him what it is. Chapter 5. The Weight of Conscience. Holmes conducted his individual interviews the following morning with a method I had observed on sufficient occasions to recognise but never quite to predict. He did not interrogate, he did not accuse. He arrived at each conversation with the unhurried demeanour of a man paying a social call, and he asked questions in the manner of one who is merely curious, gently, tangentially, with long pauses that he seemed entirely comfortable inhabiting, and which his subjects invariably moved to fill. It was in the filling of those pauses I had come to understand that he heard most clearly. Mrs. Penbury was first. Holmes requested the use of the morning room, which she granted with the quiet efficiency of a woman who's decided to manage whatever comes next with the same discipline she had applied to everything that had come before. She sat opposite Holmes at the small table by the window, and I positioned myself to one side with my notebook, a role I have long since ceased to find incongruous. Holmes began by asking after her husband's health, which was improving. He then inquired, with apparent casualness, how long the present arrangement of the study had been in place. The cabinet against the far wall, the desk position toward the window. "The cabinet has been in that position since we took the house," she said. "Those 12 years. Alistair insisted upon it from the beginning. He said the light from the window must fall on the desk and not upon the cabinet, as direct sunlight could damage the paper of the stored documents." "A practical consideration," said Holmes. "And the cabinet itself, was it purchased with the house, or did your husband bring it?" "He brought it. It was already in his possession when we married. He was very particular about it." "Quite so." Holmes turned his teacup a quarter revolution in its saucer, a gesture of such apparent idleness that only I would have known to mark it. "Mrs. Penbury, how much do you know of your husband's professional commissions? The specific nature of the documents he handles?" A brief hesitation. "Very little. Alistair has always maintained a strict separation between his domestic and professional life. I knew the names of certain clients, Colonel Harcourt, one or two others, from social occasions. The substance of the work was not discussed." "And did that separation ever trouble you?" The question was asked so gently, with so complete an absence of implication, that it might have seemed the merest conversational inquiry. Mrs. Penbury's hands, which had been resting composedly on the table, moved, just slightly, a refolding of the fingers. "A wife learns," she said, after a moment, "to accommodate the parts of a man's life that are not offered to her. Whether that accommodation troubles her is a private matter." Holmes thanked her warmly and asked nothing further. Clara Penbury was brought in next, and the contrast was instructive. Where her mother was contained, Clara was animated, not with distress precisely, but with the particular energy of a young woman who has been asked to be still for too long and is finding it effortful. She was perhaps 23, with her father's fine features and her mother's composure struggling for dominance and not entirely succeeding. She sat down with a kind of controlled force and looked at Holmes with eyes that were both frightened and combative, a combination I recognised as the characteristic expression of the genuinely innocent who have nonetheless something to protect. Holmes spoke to her first of her engagement, of the barrister Forsyth, of their plans. She answered readily enough, with a warmth that was unaffected. Then, with the same fluency of transition he had used with her mother, he said, "Your father's clients, Colonel Harcourt among them. You have known the Colonel some time, I think?" "Since I was a child, yes. He was always very kind. He took an interest in all of us." Something shifted in her expression. "He used to say that my father had a rare gift, that there was no one in London who understood old documents as he did." "And do you share that assessment of your father's gift?" Her hands, I noticed, were quite still in her lap when she spoke of Harcourt, when she discussed her engagement, when she addressed the events of the past days. They moved, a fine, involuntary tremor at the fingertips. Only when Holmes said, gently, "Your father's clients have placed great trust in him over many years. That trust must have been, at times, a considerable weight for the whole family to carry." The tremor was brief and she recovered immediately, but it was there. "Father is meticulous," she said. "Whatever has happened, I am certain it is not of his making." "I am sure you're right," said Holmes, and moved the conversation gracefully elsewhere. Colonel Harcourt arrived at 11, having been asked to return to the house. He was a broad, silver-haired man in his middle 60s, upright in the way of those for whom military bearing has become indistinguishable from temperament, with a large, honest face that was currently carrying rather more anxiety than it seemed designed to accommodate. He shook hands with Holmes with vigour and with me with courtesy, and settled into his chair with the slight excess of care that large men adopt when they wish to appear at ease. Holmes asked him about his investment in Penbury's commissions, specifically the Somerset properties referenced in the inheritance deed. Harcourt explained the arrangement without hesitation. He had advanced funds against the anticipated settlement of certain land claims, a matter that had been in Chancery for some years. Penbury had been holding the authenticated deed in trust pending the conclusion of proceedings. "The deed is now missing," Holmes observed, "so I am told." Harcourt's jaw tightened. "I will not pretend the timing is not deeply unfortunate for me. Without that document, my claim is considerably weakened." "You appreciate," said Holmes without particular inflection, "that its disappearance, combined with the financial benefit that accrues to you from its contents, places you in an uncomfortable position." Harcourt met his gaze squarely. "I appreciate it entirely. I also had no hand in it, and I trust you to establish that fact, Mr. Holmes, since it appears to be beyond my own power to do so." He paused. "What concerns me is not my own position. What concerns me is Penbury. His health, yes. But also—" He stopped. "Also?" Holmes prompted. The Colonel looked at his hat, which he had been turning in his large hands throughout. "I have known Alistair Penbury for 12 years. He's a man of considerable talent, and I believe of genuine integrity in his personal dealings. But talent in certain professions can become its own temptation. There are things I have wondered over the years, things I chose not to examine too closely. Because the results of Penbury's work were always satisfactory and I valued the friendship." He set the hat down on his knee with a kind of finality. "I wonder now whether I should have examined them." Holmes thanked him and let him go. Lyle was lost, returning to the anteroom with the same careful composure as the day before. Holmes asked him this time, not about his movements, but about his work. The specific mechanics of authentication, the methods by which document alterations were detected, the tools of the trade. Lyle answered with fluency and precision, revealing in the course of it a knowledge of the subject that went considerably beyond what a junior clerk might ordinarily be expected to possess. "You have studied this area independently," Holmes remarked. "I find it interesting," said Lyle. "The science of it?" "Quite so. Tell me, in 3 years of handling Mr. Penbury's documents at the preliminary cataloguing stage, did you ever observe anything that gave you pause? Any irregularity, however small?" The silence that followed was of a different quality from the considered pauses that had preceded Lyle's other answers. Those had been the pauses of a precise man selecting the correct word. This was the pause of a man deciding how much of the truth to offer. "Mr. Penbury," said Lyle at last, "is a man of exceptional skill. Exceptional skill can be difficult to distinguish sometimes from exceptional latitude." Holmes looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very careful answer, Mr. Lyle." "It is the most accurate one I can give you at present," said Lyle, and held Holmes's gaze without flinching. "Guilt, Holmes had told me once, reveals itself not in denial but in selective indignation." As we left Queen Anne Street that afternoon, I turned the morning's interviews over in my mind, testing each against that observation. Clara's tremor at the mention of her father's professional weight. Mrs. Penbury's accommodation of things not offered to her. Harcourt's deliberate, honest unease. And Lyle who knew too much, answered too well, and had just drawn the most precise and telling distinction of the entire morning. I did not yet know what each of them was protecting, but I was quite certain, by the time we reached Baker Street, that all of them were protecting something. Chapter 6. Loyalty and Fear. Holmes did not sleep that night. I know this not because I was present at Baker Street to witness it, but because when I called the following morning at 7:30, an hour at which I would not ordinarily have presumed upon his time, had his note not specifically requested it, I found him in his dressing gown with his pipe cold in his hand, and the sitting-room in a state that Mrs. Hudson, I reflected, would regard with magnificent and well-practised resignation. 3 of the dining chairs had been drawn into a loose triangle near the window. On each was laid a document or set of notes. The floor between them bore a scatter of papers weighted at their corners with whatever had come to hand: a paperweight, a compass, a volume of Richter on European sealing wax traditions, and, inexplicably, a jar of Mrs. Hudson's preserved plums. "You have been at it all night," I said. "Sit down, Watson, not on any of the chairs. And take the armchair." He was already moving between the 3 chairs in a circuit, hands clasped behind him, looking at each in turn as though conducting a silent examination. "I went back to Queen Anne Street at dawn." I looked up from the armchair. "Penbury permitted it?" "Penbury is not yet fully restored to authority over his own household, and Mrs. Penbury, when approached with sufficient courtesy at 6 o'clock in the morning, proved more accommodating than one might expect. I had 40 minutes in the study before the house properly woke." He stopped in his circuit. "I want to show you something. On the table, the wax samples." I went to the table where he had laid out 2 small squares of white card. Upon each was affixed a fragment of sealing wax no larger than a shirt button. The one was the deep Venetian red of Penbury's own stock. The other was lighter, a dusty coral with a subtly different surface texture, less glassy in its finish. "The foreign wax," I said, indicating the second, "which I removed from the interior of the cabinet hinge during our first visit, as you may recall. I have spent a portion of the night with Richter, and with my own notes comparing its composition against known European suppliers. The surface quality, the colour register, and the slight granularity of the break are consistent with a particular wax produced in Leipzig, and sold through a small number of specialist outlets on the continent. It is not available through any London stationer. To obtain it, one would need either a direct continental connection or access to someone who possessed such a connection." He moved back to the chairs. "Now consider the interior dust pattern of the cabinet." I had not examined this as minutely as Holmes, and said so. During my dawn visit I did so with more leisure than our first call permitted. The dust distribution within the cabinet's drawers is uneven in a manner that has nothing to do with last Wednesday's incident. One drawer, the second from the bottom on the left side, shows markedly less accumulation than the others, as though its contents have been disturbed and replaced repeatedly over a period of weeks or months. Not ransacked, consulted. Someone has been opening that specific drawer regularly, with the key since there is no damage to the lock, and with sufficient familiarity that they knew precisely which drawer they wanted. He picked up the notebook from the nearest chair. Now, that drawer, according to Penbury's inventory, contains documents relating to a single client, the Somerset land settlement, the Harcourt deed and its associated correspondence. I settled this information alongside what we already possessed, and felt the shape of things beginning to shift, as it always did at this stage. The sensation of a picture assembling itself at the edges before the centre becomes clear. "The same drawer as the missing deed," I said. "The same drawer, visited repeatedly, clandestinely over an extended period. The Leipzig wax is consistent with use during those visits. Perhaps to reseal documents that had been opened and examined, or to seal new ones introduced in place of originals." He set down the notebook. "Now I want you to consider something, Watson. We have established that the key to that cabinet has never, to Penbury's knowledge, left his person. It hangs upon his watch chain. He removes the watch chain, I presume, at night. He places it upon the nightstand or the dressing table as any man does. That window, from approximately 11 at night until 6 or 7 in the morning, represents the only interval during which the key might be accessed without Penbury's immediate awareness. But Lyle lodges here during the week," I said, and heard the implication of my own words as I gave them voice. "Lyle lodges here during the week," Holmes repeated. "He has done so for 3 years and 4 months by his own precise accounting. He has, in that time, had access to this house through every hour of every working night. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the room. And Lyle, as we observed yesterday, possesses a knowledge of document authentication and forgery detection that substantially exceeds what his stated duties require. A young man who finds the science of such things interesting enough to have studied it with some depth. You believe he used the key during the nights to access the cabinet?" "I believe he had the means and the opportunity. The The question of motive is the one that requires the most careful handling. Holmes turned, because if Lyle was accessing those documents regularly, he was not doing so to steal. Nothing was missing until last Wednesday. He was doing so to read, to examine, to compare perhaps, or what he found in the drawer against what he had catalogued during his working day. A pause. A young man of intelligence and precision, handling documents at the preliminary stage, would be well positioned to notice if what he catalogued on Monday was not precisely the same document he handled the previous Thursday. I saw it then, or began to see it. He discovered the alterations. Over time, I think, a discrepancy here, a subtle inconsistency there. Not obvious enough to be certain of at first. Penbury's work, if Penbury is indeed the author, is of the highest technical quality. But accumulated over months, the pattern would become unmistakable to an attentive mind. Holmes crossed to the Richter volume and closed it with a deliberate quietness. And when it became unmistakable, what does a young clerk do with the knowledge that his employer has been systematically falsifying legal documents? He cannot go to the police without evidence. He cannot confront Penbury without exposing himself to dismissal and professional ruin. He cannot simply leave because he knows, and that knowledge makes him complicit by proximity. He was trapped, I said. He was trapped, Holmes agreed. Loyalty and fear in almost equal measure. The loyalty of a man who has not yet decided he owes none, and the fear of a man who knows precisely how badly the exposure could go for both of them. He picked up his pipe, looked at it, and put it down again. It is a condition that produces in certain temperaments a very particular response, not flight, not confession, something more deliberate. He left the thought unfinished, which was unlike him, and I did not press it. The morning light was strengthening at the window, and from below came the distant domestic sound of Mrs. Hudson, moving about her kitchen with the ordered industry of a woman who has learned to live alongside the irregular. "You said you had something to show me from the dawn visit," I said. "Is there more?" "One thing." Holmes took from the pocket of his dressing gown a small slip of paper, not a document, but a note, handwritten in a clear, economical hand. He held it out to me, but did not relinquish it. I read it where he held it. It was a list of dates, 6 of them, spanning the past 7 months, each followed by a brief notation in the same hand. The notations were oblique, abbreviations, reference numbers, but 2 of the dates were ones I recognised. The date of our first visit to Queen Anne Street, and the date of Penbury's collapse. "Where did you find this?" I asked. "In the lining of the second drawer from the bottom," said Holmes. "The one with the disturbed dust. It had been folded very small and pressed into the interior seam." He folded it again and returned it to his pocket. "It is not Penbury's hand. I compared it with his intake ledger this morning." We looked at one another for a moment in the quiet room. "Then whose is it?" I asked, though I believed I already knew. "That," said Holmes, reaching at last for his tobacco, "is a question to which I intend to have a definitive answer before nightfall." Chapter 7. The Convenient Explanation. By mid-afternoon of that same day, the atmosphere at Queen Anne Street had acquired the particular heaviness of a house in which an explanation has been found and accepted, not because it is satisfactory, but because it is available. I recognised the quality of it the moment we were admitted. The manservant's expression had shifted from anxious uncertainty to something more settled and more sombre, the expression of a household that has located its grief and is now making room for it. Mrs. Penbury received us in the drawing-room with Colonel Harcourt present, which I had not anticipated. He stood near the fireplace, his large hands clasped before him, his face carrying that combination of vindication and distaste that honest men wear when circumstances have moved in their favour through no action of their own. Mrs. Penbury sat with the composed rigidity of a woman bracing against a succession of shocks, and Clara occupied a chair slightly apart from the others, her eyes reddened but her chin level. "There have been developments," said Mrs. Penbury before Holmes could speak. "I am aware," said Holmes, which was perhaps not entirely accurate, but was, I judged, strategically sound. Edmund Lyle was seen. She drew a breath of precise length. By Thomas, our manservant, on the evening of the incident. Thomas had occasion to pass the study at approximately 9 o'clock. The door was not fully closed. He saw Lyle inside at the cabinet. Thomas did not mention this previously, said Holmes. Thomas, said Mrs. Penbury, with a restraint that conveyed considerable feeling, did not believe it was his place to speak without being directly asked, as he came to me this morning of his own accord once he understood the gravity of the matter. Holmes received this without visible reaction. And where is Mr. Lyle now? In his room. He has not attempted to leave. When I informed him that Thomas had spoken, he offered no denial. He said only that it was more complicated than it appeared, which is precisely what one would expect a guilty man to say. Colonel Harcourt cleared his throat. The deed, Mr. Holmes, the missing deed. I think we are all arrived at the same conclusion. Are we? Said Holmes, not as a question. Harcourt pressed forward regardless, with the directness of a military man who has decided upon an objective. Lyle handled the preliminary cataloguing of every document that entered this house. He had opportunity to examine the deed, to understand its value to me, and, being a young man of uncertain prospects and considerable professional knowledge, to perceive in its disappearance a means of leverage, or sale. Leverage against whom? Holmes asked. The Colonel hesitated fractionally. Against Penbury? Against myself? Both? Possibly. Holmes turned to Mrs. Penbury. May I speak with Lyle? She indicated her assent with a slight movement of the head, and we were shown upstairs by Thomas, a solidly built young man whose discomfort at his new prominence in the affair was legible in every step, to the room Lyle occupied at the rear of the house. It was a small, orderly room, as I might have predicted. A narrow bed made with military precision, a writing table bearing a single lamp and a stack of reference volumes, a washstand and a travelling case in the corner that had not been packed. Lyle sat at the writing table. He turned when we entered but did not rise, which struck me less as insolence than as exhaustion. He looked younger in that room than he had in the anteroom, younger and, for the first time, not quite in command of his own composure. They have settled upon me, he said without preamble. The householders formed a view, Holmes agreed, taking the room's single spare chair and positioning it with the ease of a man making himself at home, in a space that is not his. I should like to hear yours. Something shifted in Lyle's face, a controlled relaxation, as though the expected had arrived and could now be prepared for. You're not here to charge me, then? I am here to understand. There is a meaningful distance between the two. Holmes settled back. You were in the study on Wednesday evening. Thomas saw you at the cabinet. Yes. The key? You used your own. A pause of considerable weight. Yes. You made a duplicate. Over what period? Lyle looked at his hands on the table. The hands of a young man who works with paper and ink, I noticed, fine-fingered and ink-stained at the right forefinger's edge. I filed it over 6 sessions across 3 weeks. The key hangs outside Mr. Penbury's door each morning while he bathes. 7 minutes on average. It was sufficient. I confess I had not expected the admission to come so directly or so completely. Holmes showed no surprise. He waited with the patience of a man who understands that a confession begun will find its own momentum. I had known for 4 months, said Lyle. He spoke carefully, as one assembling facts rather than excuses. I noticed the first discrepancy in June. A will whose signature did not precisely match the intake notation I had made the previous week. I thought initially that I had made an error. I am not in the habit of making errors, but I allowed for the possibility. He paused. By August, I had found 3 further inconsistencies across different clients' documents. The pattern was unmistakable. Documents were being altered, sometimes subtly, sometimes quite substantially, between their arrival and their lodgment in the cabinet. And you concluded that Penbury was responsible, said Holmes. Who else could it be? He is the only person in this house who combines the skill and the access. The alterations are of the highest technical order. I have read enough on the subject to recognise work that would deceive 9 authenticators in 10. He looked up. I confronted him 3 weeks ago. I told him what I had found and what I believed. His response? Lyle's jaw tightened minutely. He denied it. Then, when I made clear that I had documented evidence, the list of dates, the specific discrepancies, he did not deny it further. He said instead that I did not understand the complexities of his trade, that certain clients required certain accommodations, that my position in his firm was contingent upon my discretion. A beat of silence. He threatened me with dismissal and, more than that, with the suggestion that my own handling of the documents during preliminary cataloguing might be made to appear irregular if necessary. Holmes was very still. He proposed to make you the author of his own forgeries. He did, not in those words, but plainly enough. Lyle exhaled. I left the conversation without responding. I needed time. I needed to think clearly about what I was in a position to prove and to whom I might prove it. And in the meantime, Holmes said, you returned to the cabinet at night using your duplicate key to continue gathering evidence. Yes, the list of dates in the drawer lining, that was my record of each visit. The documents I'd compared, the dates on which alterations appeared to have been made. He looked at Holmes with an expression that was not quite an appeal. On Wednesday evening I went to retrieve it. I intended to take it and the most damning of the document comparisons to a solicitor I trust. I did not intend what happened. What did happen? Penbury came in while I was at the cabinet. I had not heard him on the stair. He saw me, saw the open cabinet, the key in my hand. He understood immediately that I had not stopped, that I had continued despite his warning. Lyle's voice was steady but effortful. He was very angry, not loudly, but with that cold, contained quality that is, I think, worse. Then he simply stopped, mid-sentence. He put his hand to his chest and sat down on the floor, very slowly, and then he was unconscious. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a cart horse's hooves measured the street in a slow, patient rhythm. You did not harm him, I said. It was not a question. I did not touch him, said Lyle. I called for help immediately, whatever else I have done in this house, and I called for help at once. Holmes rose and moved to the window, looking out at the narrow back garden below. His reflection in the glass was as composed as his original. When he turned, I read in his face what I had occasionally seen there before. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but the particular quality of a man who has identified the shape of a thing and is now measuring its weight. The deed, Mr. Lyle, he said quietly. The Harcourt deed. Where is it? Lyle reached into the inside pocket of his coat, which hung on the back of his chair, and placed a folded document on the writing table between them. I took it to preserve it, he said. Penbury had altered it. I wanted it beyond his reach. Holmes looked at the deed but did not take it immediately. You understand, he said, that the version of events I have just heard and the version being assembled downstairs are not the same version. I understand it very well, said Lyle. That is why I did not attempt to leave. Holmes picked up the deed at last and tucked it into his breast pocket. He said nothing further to Lyle, but as we left the room he paused in the doorway and spoke without turning. You were right, he said, not to go. We descended the stairs into the heavy quiet of the house below, and I thought, not for the first time, that the truth in certain matters is not a thing that liberates cleanly. It arrives, rather, with all the weight of the consequences it will now require someone to bear. Chapter 8. The Dust Within the Drawer. Holmes did not speak on the journey back to Baker Street. He sat with the Harcourt deed folded in his breast pocket, and his gaze directed at the passing streets with that quality of fixed inattention that meant his mind was occupied somewhere quite other than the cab window. I have learned over many years to read the grades of his silence as one reads weather. Some silences are productive and should not be disturbed, others are processional and invite quiet company, and some are the silences of a man who has most of what he needs and is waiting with controlled impatience for the final piece. This one, I judged, was of the third kind. Mrs. Hudson met us at the foot of the stairs with the information that a police inspector had called and left his card. Holmes glanced at it without breaking stride and placed it on the mantelpiece beside the others. "Lestrade," he said. "A day earlier than I expected. The household will have sent word. Sit down, Watson. I want to go through the physical evidence once more before he arrives, and I want a second pair of eyes." He spread his materials across the table. The document comparisons, the wax samples, the notebook of the inventory, and now the recovered deed, which he unfolded with the careful reverence of a man handling evidence rather than property. He laid it beside the land transfer we had examined 2 days prior and stood back. "Tell me what you see," he said. I studied the 2 documents with the thoroughness I could manage. The deed appears complete. The seal is intact. The red wax, Penbury's own. The handwriting of the body is consistent throughout. I leaned closer. Though here, I indicated a passage near the foot of the first page, the ink appears marginally darker, as you noted in the transfer. "As I noted in the transfer," Holmes confirmed. "Now look at the seal." I examined it through the glass he handed me. The seal was a fine impression, the cipher clear and the wax well set. But at its lower right edge, where the wax had been pressed most thinly, there was a hairline discontinuity. Not a crack acquired through handling, but a line that ran with a faint deliberateness, as though the seal had been applied in 2 stages rather than 1. "It has been resealed," I said, "lifted and replaced. With considerable skill. The cipher stamp was applied twice, which is why the edge does not quite cohere. The document was opened, amended, and resealed with Penbury's own wax and stamp. An operation requiring not only access to the deed itself, but access to Penbury's seal and to his supply of Venetian red wax." Holmes picked up the deed and set it beside the wax sample cards. "The seal matches Penbury's own stock precisely. The same wax he uses in practice, the same stamp, not the Leipzig composition." "Which rules out Lyle as the forger," I said. "Lyle had access to the cabinet, but not to the seal stamp which Penbury keeps in his desk's latching drawer. Lyle told us himself that the preliminary folder on the desk surface is accessible, but the latching drawer is not. The resealed deed was altered by someone who could reach both the stored document and the locked desk drawer." He returned the deed to the table. "That person is Penbury." It was a conclusion I'd been approaching for some days, but hearing it stated with that clean finality produced in me a particular feeling. Not surprise, as I have said, but a kind of sad recognition. The same feeling I imagine that a physician experiences when the diagnosis he has feared turns out to be the correct one. "There is still the matter of the graphite," said Holmes, moving to his notes. "The thin residue I observed along the interior hinge of the cabinet during my dawn examination. Graphite of the kind produced by the repeated action of a filed key. The filing process leaves traces that transfer to adjacent metal surfaces with use over time." He looked up. "The graphite is present on the hinge, not on the lock. The lock itself is clean. If Lyle had produced his duplicate by filing, the graphite residue would be at the lock cylinder, where the duplicate first engages. It is not." I followed the reasoning to its destination. "The graphite is from a different key operation entirely. A key duplicated not by filing the blank against the original, but by taking an impression, a process that involves pressing the original key into a prepared medium, and then cutting the duplicate from the impression. Filing of the impression medium is part of that process, and the graphite from such filing would transfer to the hinge via the surface contact of repeated use." He paused. "It is a more precise method than filing directly. It is the method of a man with a craftsman's instinct for accuracy." "Penbury," I said again. "Penbury, who at some point had a second key to his own cabinet made by impression, and who has been using it, or allowing it to be used, in circumstances he has not disclosed to us." Holmes pulled his chair to the table and sat, folding his hands before him. "Consider the sequence from the beginning, Watson, with what we now possess. Penbury has been altering documents for years, wills, deeds, land transfers, with a skill that would deceive almost any eye. Some of these alterations have benefited his clients. Some have been more self-serving. The practice has been consistent and profitable and, until recently, entirely undiscovered. Until Lyle, I said. Until Lyle, who was sharp enough to perceive the pattern over time, and honest enough to be disturbed by it. Lyle confronts Penbury. Penbury threatens him. And at this point, here is what I had not quite resolved until this morning. Penbury finds himself in a position he has not previously inhabited. He has a witness. A documentarian witness, furthermore, who has been keeping his own careful record. Holmes spread his fingers on the table. Penbury cannot dismiss Lyle without creating an aggrieved former employee in possession of damaging knowledge. He cannot continue as before without risk. He needs the situation to resolve itself in a direction that does not implicate him. I saw it. He arranged the scene himself. He opened the cabinet. He scattered the papers. He chose the Harcourt deed specifically, a document whose disappearance would immediately suggest Harcourt's financial motive, and whose reappearance in Lyle's possession would confirm the clerk's guilt. He worked at the desk, making a final amendment to another document, and then, and this is where design collided with biology, the shock of his own calculated deception, or perhaps the accumulated stress of weeks of threatened exposure, produced the cardiac episode that was not in his plan. Holmes was quiet for a moment. He did not intend to collapse, Watson, but he collapsed, and in doing so he created a scene that served his purpose perhaps better than the one he had designed, a helpless victim rather than a calculating schemer. Lyle discovered at the cabinet, the deed missing, the evidence pointing cleanly away from himself. The afternoon light had moved while Holmes was speaking, and now lay at a long amber angle across the table, touching the documents in a way that made them seem, for a moment, almost warm. He must have known we would find the graphite, I said. He must have known the physical evidence would not fully support his version. He counted on the surface explanation being sufficient, said Holmes, and he nearly succeeded. Thomas's testimony about Lyle at the cabinet, the missing deed found on Lyle's person, the duplicate key, taken together, these form a narrative that a magistrate could act upon without ever looking at the interior dust pattern of a single drawer. He stood, moving to the window. It is a common error, Watson. Criminals who are also intelligent men frequently design to the level of the official investigation rather than to the level of the exceptional one. You're not, I take it, going to allow Lestrade to charge Lyle. Holmes turned from the window with something that was very nearly a smile. I am going to allow Lestrade to arrive, to hear the evidence as assembled by the household and to form a view, and then I am going to dismantle that view methodically and with, I hope, sufficient clarity that the correct conclusion becomes unavoidable for all concerned. He crossed to the mantelpiece and retrieved the inspector's card. But first I am going to send him a note asking him to come tomorrow morning rather than this evening, because there remains one physical confirmation I want before I lay out the complete case. What confirmation? The duplicate key to the cabinet, said Holmes. Not Lyle's, the other one. Penbury's own copy, made by impression, which he used to stage the scene and which is now somewhere in that house. When I have found it, Watson, we shall have everything. He moved to his desk and reached for a sheet of paper. Be here at 8 tomorrow. Bring your coat. The morning will be cold, and the matter will be concluded before noon. He wrote his note to Lestrade with swift, decisive strokes, and I sat for a moment longer at the table, looking at the document spread before me. The careful, beautiful forgeries of a gifted and frightened man, and beside them the plain record of a young clerk's months of quiet, solitary and entirely unrewarded honesty. It was not a comfortable thing to look at, and I was glad when Mrs. Hudson came up with the tea. Chapter 9. The Truth Disclosed. Lestrade arrived at Queen Anne Street at 10:30 the following morning, having received Holmes's revised note with what I imagined was a mixture of professional deference and personal irritation, the characteristic blend that Holmes invariably produced in him. He was a compact, quick-eyed man with the brisk manner of one who has learned that decisiveness is the next best thing to brilliance, and he greeted us in the hallway with the air of a man who has already formed his conclusions, and is present largely as a courtesy. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I have read the household's account. The evidence against the clerk appears substantial. I should like to speak with him this morning and proceed from there." "By all means," said Holmes pleasantly, "though I wonder if you might permit me 20 minutes in the study first. There is a small physical matter I should like to resolve before we assemble." Lestrade looked at him with the expression of a man weighing professional dignity against the knowledge that Holmes's small physical matters had a historical tendency to overturn everything. Professional dignity capitulated, as it generally did. 20 minutes, said he. Holmes and I went directly to the study. Penbury was not yet downstairs. His physician had recommended a further day of rest, which Holmes had perhaps anticipated. The room was as we had last seen it, restored now to its surface order by domestic habit, the papers returned to the cabinet, the blotter replaced. Holmes stood in the doorway for a moment with his gaze moving slowly around the room in the systematic manner of a surveyor, beginning at the floor and working upward. "Or the key," I said, keeping my voice low. "Where would a man conceal a duplicate in his own study?" "Not where a stranger would look," said Holmes, moving to the desk. "The duplicate is not a trophy. It is a tool that has served its purpose and become a liability. A man in Penbury's position, clearing away the evidence of his own staging, would want it gone. But he was unconscious before he could remove it from the house, and he has not been in this room since, so it remains." He began with the desk, working outward. The latching drawer he opened with the small key that hung upon it. Penbury's study key, distinct from the cabinet key, which Mrs. Penbury had surrendered to Holmes for the duration. Inside the drawer were the seal stamp, 3 nibs in paper wrappings, a small account book and a folded reference sheet. Holmes examined each briefly, replaced each, and moved to the shelves. He did not search randomly. He moved along the shelves with the selectivity that suggested he was looking not everywhere but somewhere specific, his fingers trailing lightly along the spines of the document boxes without disturbing them, pausing at intervals that I could not immediately account for. At the 3rd shelf from the bottom, his hand stopped. He withdrew a document box labelled, in Penbury's precise hand, Miscellaneous Correspondence, 1889. He set it on the desk, lifted the lid, and there, pressed flat beneath a folded sheet of paper at the bottom of the box, was a key. It was a Brahma key, identical in pattern to the one on Penbury's watch chain, but newer in its finish, less worn at the bow, over the metal still carrying a slight machined brightness that the original had long since lost to daily use. "There," said Holmes with a quiet completeness that required no elaboration. He wrapped it in his handkerchief and placed it in his pocket, and we returned to the hallway, where Lestrade was consulting his watch with the studied patience of a man demonstrating that 20 minutes means 20 minutes. Holmes requested that the household be assembled in the drawing-room. It took some 15 minutes to achieve this, Mrs. Penbury composed as ever, Clara, whose eyes moved from Holmes to Lestrade and back with a barely suppressed apprehension, Colonel Harcourt standing again near the fireplace as though position were equivalent to certainty, and Lyle, who entered last and stood slightly apart from the others, his face carrying the careful neutrality of a man who has decided to let events proceed without attempting to influence them. Penbury himself was brought down in a dressing gown, his physician's protests having been overridden with gentle firmness by Holmes, who had represented to Mrs. Penbury that her husband's presence was not merely desirable, but essential. He sat in the armchair that had been placed for him, and looked at Holmes across the room with an expression I found difficult to read. Not fear, precisely, and not defiance, but the complex, exhausted look of a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has perhaps begun to understand that he is shortly to be relieved of it. Holmes stood before the fireplace and spoke without theatricality, in the measured, a conversational tone he used when the facts were sufficient to carry themselves. "I shall be brief," he said, "because the matter, though intricate in its details, is simple in its substance. Mr. Penbury has, over a period of years, systematically altered documents entrusted to him by his clients. He possesses the skill to do so without detection by any ordinary examination, and he has applied that skill with the discipline of a professional. Some alterations have been made for financial gain. Others have been made to protect previous alterations from scrutiny. The pattern, once one knows where to look for it, is consistent and, I am afraid, unmistakable." The room was very still. Mrs. Penbury did not move. Clara's hands were clasped in her lap with a tightness that whitened the knuckles. Harcourt was watching Penbury with the expression of a man recalibrating a long-held belief. 4 months ago, Holmes continued, Mr. Lyle became aware of this pattern. He confronted Mr. Penbury, who responded by threatening both Lyle's employment and his professional reputation. Finding himself trapped between knowledge he could not safely act upon and a position he could not safely abandon, Lyle did what a precise and methodical man does under such circumstances. He continued to gather evidence, using a duplicate key he had made to access the cabinet during the night hours. Holmes paused and let the room absorb this before proceeding. "Last Wednesday evening, Mr. Penbury staged the scene we discovered. He opened the cabinet with his own duplicate key, a key he had cut by impression at some earlier point, for purposes that predate this incident, scattered papers on the desk, removed the Harcourt deed, and sat at the desk to make a final amendment to one of the remaining documents. His intention was to create the appearance of a theft attributable to Lyle or to Colonel Harcourt, and to present himself as the victim of a violation he had, in fact, orchestrated entirely. The cardiac episode that followed was not part of his design. It was an involuntary consequence of the stress of what he had undertaken." Lestrade, to his credit, had said nothing. He stood to one side with his notebook open, and the look of a man filing information rapidly, and revising his morning's intentions with each sentence. Holmes drew the duplicate key from his breast pocket in its handkerchief wrapping. "This key was recovered from a document box in this study within the last half hour. It is a Brahma key, impression made, newer in its wear than the original on Mr. Penbury's watch chain. It will be found, upon examination, to match the cabinet lock precisely. It is not Lyle's key. Lyle's duplicate was filed, and the graphite distribution on the cabinet hinge reflects the impression method, not the filing method. This is Penbury's key, made for a purpose that he has not disclosed, and concealed in a location chosen to survive a cursory search." He laid the key on the table. Penbury had not spoken throughout. He sat in his armchair with his dressing gown drawn around him, and his hands quite still, and when Holmes finished he remained still for what felt like a full half-minute. Then he looked at his daughter. Clara met his gaze. Something passed between them that I will not pretend to have fully understood. Not forgiveness, not accusation, but something older and more private than either. The look of two people who have just had the same realization at the same moment, and are each deciding what to do with it. "The alterations to the Harcourt deed and the others," said Penbury at last, in a voice that was quiet and remarkably steady, "were mine. Lyle had no part in them. He discovered them. He was right to be disturbed by them." A pause. "I should like to speak with my family before I speak with the police." "You shall," said Holmes. He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I believe you have sufficient to proceed, and sufficient also to direct your proceedings correctly. I trust the distinction between Mr. Lyle's actions and Mr. Penbury's will be reflected in whatever charges are brought." Lestrade looked at the key, at Holmes, at Penbury, and finally at his notebook. "I think," he said, with the deliberate understatement of a man absorbing a great deal at once, "that I shall need a somewhat fuller statement than I had anticipated." "They generally do," said Holmes, and I thought I detected, in the set of his shoulders, as he turned toward the door, the particular quality of a man who has done what he came to do, and is content to leave the remainder to others. I followed him into the corridor, and we stood for a moment in the quiet of the hallway. The muffled sounds of the drawing-room behind us, the ordinary sounds of the London street before us, and I thought that truth, when it finally arrives in a room, does not always announce itself with great noise. Sometimes it simply settles, like dust after a long disturbance, and everything it touches is permanently, quietly, changed. Chapter 10. Reason and Mercy. A fortnight passed before the affair at Queen Anne Street reached what Holmes, in one of his more precise formulations, called its equilibrium, the point at which every consequence has found its proper level, and the matter may be considered, if not concluded, then at least settled. I had occasion during those 2 weeks to observe the resolution of several threads, and to reflect, not for the first time in our long association, upon the considerable distance that exists between what the law can accomplish and what justice, in its fullest sense, requires. Penbury survived. His physician, a careful and conscientious man named Anstruther, reported that the cardiac episode had been severe but not irreparable, and that with rest and a material reduction in what he diplomatically termed the pressures of professional life, a reasonable recovery was to be expected. I visited twice during that fortnight, once in my capacity as a colleague of Anstruther's, and once at Holmes's quiet suggestion. On the second visit I found Penbury sitting up, the colour returned to his face though not to his eyes, which carried the particular quality of a man who has looked at himself steadily and not found the view entirely comfortable. He did not speak of the investigation. He spoke instead of Clara's engagement, of her young barrister Forsyth, of their prospects. He spoke of the house in Queen Anne Street and whether it had been wise to take so large a property. He spoke, in other words, of everything that lay on the other side of what he had done, as though by mapping the future carefully enough he might establish that it still existed. I listened, and said what I could in the way of ordinary encouragement, and left him to it. A physician learns, as a detective must, when the useful thing is silence. The legal matter was handled with less public noise than I had anticipated. Lestrade, to his considerable credit, had grasped the essential distinction between Lyell's actions and Penbury's with an alacrity that spoke well of him. Lyell was not charged. The duplicate key he had made and the nocturnal examinations he'd conducted were acknowledged, in private consultation between Lestrade and the relevant solicitors, near to constitute a kind of informal and extra-legal investigation, undertaken in the absence of any other recourse, irregular certainly, but not criminal in intent or in consequence. He had stolen nothing. He had concealed nothing, except from the man who had threatened him, and he had produced, from his months of careful documentation, the most substantial body of independent evidence against Penbury that existed. Penbury himself entered into a private arrangement that Holmes had, with quiet efficiency, helped to negotiate. There would be no public trial. The families and institutions whose documents had been altered were approached through intermediaries, the alterations disclosed, remedies proposed. Several of these disclosures were deeply unwelcome. The Somerset land settlement was among them. The Harcourt deed, restored now to its unaltered form, proved to be rather less favourable to the Colonel than the amended version had suggested. Harcourt received this information in the same large, honest way he received everything, with visible effort and genuine dignity, and to his credit said only that he preferred an accurate loss to a falsified gain. Clara's dowry, which one of the altered land transfers had placed in jeopardy, was secured through a separate arrangement that I did not inquire into too closely. Forsyth, the young barrister, when quietly informed of certain aspects of the situation by Holmes, aspects sufficient to account for the irregular circumstances without specifying every particular, behaved in a manner that raised him considerably in my estimation. He did not withdraw, he said, and as Holmes reported it to me with characteristic brevity, that he was engaged to Clara Penbury, not to her father's ledgers, and that he saw no reason to revise the arrangement. Lyell left the house in Queen Anne Street the week after the disclosure, as was inevitable, and found a position within a fortnight at a firm of document archivists in Bloomsbury, whose principal had been quietly informed, again through Holmes's intervention, that the young man coming to him possessed exceptional abilities and an unusually thorough grounding in the detection of manuscript irregularity. Whether the principal appreciated the slight irony of this qualification, I cannot say. The position was offered and accepted, and Lyell began it with what I imagined was a complicated mixture of relief and exhaustion that would gradually in time become simply a life. It was on the last day of October that Holmes and I sat together at Baker Street in the early evening, the fire built high against a night that had turned decisively autumnal, and I permitted myself the reflection that we had arrived at the other side of the matter. Holmes was in his armchair with his pipe and a look of settled attention that I associated with the close of a case. Not quite satisfaction, which was too simple a word, but something more like the equanimity of a craftsman who has done the work and examined the result and found it to be, within the limits of the possible, what it should be. "Lyle," I said,